It was a winter night in southern Brazil, July 2015. A 22-year-old guy parked his car in a square in a residential neighborhood and stayed there waiting. He was anxious, but it was a good kind of anxiety because he was about to meet a woman he was supposedly in love with. They had been seeing each other in secret for a few months because the situation was quite complicated. She lived with another man, a dangerous guy. At some point, she texted this guy and said she needed to say goodbye because she was going to São Paulo. When her car showed up, he got out of his own vehicle and got into the passenger seat, just like they had agreed. She was wearing a hood with her head down. He found it strange but didn't have time to process it because at that moment, someone who was hiding in the back seat of the car pressed the barrel of a gun to his head and told him to keep quiet. The guy didn't understand anything. He looked to the side, looked back. The woman he liked so much was there at the wheel. After that, the car left, got on a highway, and started driving. And from that moment on, the guy no longer had any control over what was going to happen to him. I'm Marcos Campos. And in this story, we're going to meet a young, talented photographer who had even worked at the Rio Grande do Sul State Government Palace, and who was murdered with 19 shots in an ambush. That was the night I mentioned in the introduction. And the scariest part is that the call that led him to the place where he died came from the cell phone of someone he trusted. And then questions arise, obviously, about this person he trusted. Did they know what would happen that night? Was she an accomplice or was she as much a victim as he was? Why did two different jury trials at different times judging the same case come to completely opposite conclusions? And how did the murderer, convicted more than 20 years ago, manage to escape the country and live in Bolivia under a false name? Well, that's what we're going to investigate together in today's episode. Leave a like, comment, or emoji, and become a member if possible. There are new episodes here every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and that takes care of the announcements. Let's get to the facts. So, the photographer. José Gustavo Virtual Gargioni grew up in the metropolitan region of Porto Alegre, and from an early age he was interested in photography. The guy was good at what he did. Okay guys? So much so that, at just over 20 years old, he had already landed a job as the official photographer of Palacio Piratini, which is the seat of the government of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, during the term of then-Governor Tarso Genro. Gustavo worked for about 2 years covering the government's official events as a photographer. For such a young guy, that was no small feat, you know? Working inside one of the most important buildings in the state, photographing authorities, political events, official ceremonies, and Gustavo was one of those professionals who took his work very seriously, with skill, dedication, and a trained eye to capture the right moment. In 2015, Gustavo was no longer at Piratini, okay? He had moved to an event production company in Canoas, a city in the metropolitan area of Porto Alegre. He worked covering birthday parties and social events. He was 22 years old when everything happened, and his life was going really well. But then, at a certain point, during one of these events he was covering, he met someone who would forever change the course of his life. The person in question was Paula Caroline Ferreira Rodriguez, and their meeting happened in the most ordinary way possible, at a 15th birthday party. Paula's sister was turning 15. The family had hired a production company to do the photography, and Gustavo was the photographer. According to the statement Paula gave years later in court, she spent the whole day crying at the party. Gustavo noticed this and went over to talk to her. He talked to her, tried to have a conversation, asked what was going on. She said she lived with a violent man who abused her and controlled her every move. Gustavo then tried to calm her down. He told her to enjoy the party and clear her mind. He showed her the photos he had taken. Basically, he was trying to distract her from what she was feeling. At the end of that night, he saved his number on her phone. Paula didn't call him back. But a few days later, she went to the production company where Gustavo worked to take care of a work issue. There at the production company, he asked why she hadn't gotten in touch. And then, the two of them started talking. The problem was that Paula, at that time, had already been living with another man for years. And he wasn't just any man, okay? The man Paula was living with was Juliano Biron da Silva, and to understand the size of the problem Gustavo was getting himself into, probably without knowing, you need to understand who Juliano was. Juliano Biron was identified by the police as one of the main leaders of the Osmanos gang, considered the largest criminal organization in Rio Grande do Sul. The gang emerged in the 1980s inspired by groups from Rio de Janeiro and grew until it dominated drug trafficking in much of the state, and Biron was not a foot soldier, he was one of the leaders. Just to give you an idea of his power, according to civil police investigations, Biron moved about 400 kilos of cocaine and crack per month, generating a profit, an estimated profit of 2 million reais per month. With that money, he laundered that money through an empire of front businesses, a chain of snack bars, a car dealership, transport companies, a luxury nightclub supposedly inside the Grêmio Arena, properties in gated communities, and an apartment in a resort town. And even a mansion valued at 1 million reais in Cachoeirinha. Over the years, the police have identified assets linked to Biron valued at more than 120 million reais. This was the man Paula had been living with since she was 13 years old, according to her statement. She said that, at first, she thought this man was a businessman who lived a life of parties, restaurants, and travel. But over time, she started to find out who he really was. And when she tried to end the relationship, according to her, Biron would threaten her. According to Paula, he once told her mother that he wouldn't let her live her own life and that he loved her more than he loved his own children. Whether this is true or not, whether all the implications of this line of thinking, this way of speaking, have any basis, truth, or deeper layers to them, we don't know. What we do know is that afterwards, 2 jury trials tried to answer some of these questions and disagreed. But we'll get there. What we do know for sure is that starting in November 2014, Gustavo and Paula started getting involved. The relationship had to be completely hidden for obvious reasons. According to Paula, she would swap phones with her sister so she could send messages to Gustavo without Biron noticing. The two communicated through Facebook and by phone, always with the utmost care. And here comes an important detail. According to Paula's statement, Gustavo knew that she was married, let's say, to someone connected to crime. He knew the situation was dangerous, but according to the investigations, he had no idea who Juliano Biron really was. Maybe he didn't know the extent of the danger. Maybe he thought it was just a street dealer, a violent guy, but with limited reach. But he definitely wasn't. The two of them kept seeing each other in secret from November 2014 until July 2015. Almost 8 months, and during that whole period, according to the investigations, Biron didn't suspect a thing until the night of July 27, 2015. Easy. There are 2 versions of what happened that day, okay? There's the version from the police and the public prosecutor's office, and the version that Paula told in court in 2023 supported by her defense. Both agree on several points, but they also differ on the most important ones, let's say. Whether Paula knew or not what was going to happen that fateful night, what the investigation found is the following. According to the analysis of the messages and the phone records themselves, Paula was in frequent contact with Gustavo, and on that day, she supposedly insisted on arranging a meeting with him. They agreed to meet at a spot in the Igara neighborhood, in Canoas. Gustavo then went there with his car, and when he arrived, he got a call from Paula changing the meeting place to another street in the same neighborhood. Gustavo went there, parked his car, and waited. After her car arrived, he got out and got into the passenger seat. It was nighttime and he sat there calmly. Paula was wearing a hood with her head down. Juliano Biron was hiding in the back seat, armed with a pistol. Paula's version, told years later in court, is different on this main point, okay? According to her, that day, she had called Gustavo to say goodbye because she was planning to move to São Paulo. She said that Biron no longer lived with her at that time, but that she was still forced to stay in his apartment. And that in the middle of her conversation with Gustavo by text, Biron suddenly showed up at the apartment without warning. Her phone was charging, and then a Facebook notification popped up on the screen. Biron saw it, grabbed the phone by force, read the messages, and ended up finding out everything. From that point on, according to Paula, Biron hit her on the head with the butt of a gun and gave the order. Either she called Gustavo and lured him to a meeting, or he would kill her entire family. She said she had no doubt that he was indeed capable of carrying out that threat. Regardless of which of the two versions is true, what happened after that is confirmed by the investigation and by more than 300 hours of footage from 80 security cameras that the police analyzed later. And what happened is this. Gustavo got into the car, Biron pointed the gun at him and told him to be quiet. The car then left the Higara neighborhood and entered the Tabai highway, then took the BR 448, and they kept driving around there. Biron was asking questions, like how the two had met, how long they had been seeing each other, details about their relationship. Questions that, according to Paula, neither she nor Gustavo could answer. They drove around the highways 3 times. Gustavo, not knowing what to expect anymore, ended up asking Biron what he intended to do, and the answer was direct. He said he was going to kill them both. At that moment, Gustavo made what was probably a desperate decision, the only one that came to his mind, which was to try to jump out of the moving car. Paula, who was driving, then hit the brakes. Biron thought she was, reacting, and hit her on the head with the butt of his gun. Then, he took the wheel of the car, went around the car, and stopped in front of Gustavo, who was lying there on the road. What happened next was documented by the forensic team. Gustavo was beaten and then shot 19 times with a pistol. Biron fired all the rounds at the photographer right there on the access road to Prainha do Paquetá in the Mato Grande neighborhood in Canoas. This happened around 12:30 a.m. on July 28, 2015. After the shots, according to Paula, they went back to the apartment in Porto Alegre. Biron locked the windows, afraid she might try to take her own life, and slept next to her there, as if life was just going on. On the morning of July 28, Gustavo's body was found there on Paquetá Beach. He had signs of a beating, blows from a gun butt, and 19 gunshot wounds. Like I said, he was 22 years old. His family didn't know anything until then. Gustavo simply hadn't come home that night. And then, the scramble began to figure out what had happened to that young photographer who, overnight, was found dead in that remote place in Canoas in such a violent way. The investigation was handled by the Homicide and Personal Protection Division, under the command of Chief Inspector Marco Antonio Arruda Gantz. And what his team did in the following months was to put together piece by piece the puzzle of that night. 300 hours of footage. Detective Marco Gans and the DHPP team started with what they had that was most concrete, the security cameras. And there was a lot of cameras, okay? The investigation collected recordings from 80 different cameras totaling more than 300 hours of video. With this extensive material, they were able to reconstruct Gustavo's final route from the moment he left his house to the Higara neighborhood, where he left his own car parked, and from there, the route of the car he got into, driving along Tabai on the BR 448 to Paquetá Beach. But the cameras alone didn't reveal who was inside the car. What tied the whole investigation together were the messages. The police analyzed the Facebook conversations between Paula and Gustavo and saw that she had insisted on arranging a meeting that night, and it was her who changed the meeting point at the last minute, leading Gustavo to the place where the car with Biron was waiting. The combination of evidence, cameras, messages, ballistics analysis, and phone analysis pointed to Juliano's name, Biron da Silva as the shooter, and Paula Caroline as the person who lured the victim into the ambush. According to the police, the motive was jealousy. After the crime, Paula and Biron disappeared. They went to Santa Catarina. She stayed in one apartment and he in another. According to Paula's account, Biron kept her isolated from her family for months, not allowing her to talk to anyone. He only gave in when her mother said she was going to file a missing person report in January 2016. Almost 6 months after the murder, the police found them in Balneario Camboriú. Juliano was arrested on January 23rd. According to Paula, when the police caught him, he was with another woman, already in another apartment, and it was Biron who gave Paula's location to the police. And she was arrested the next day, January 24th. But there's always a but, isn't there? Biron's arrest opened the door to something far beyond Gustavo's murder. A few days later, the Narcotics Investigation Department conducted searches at a nightclub inside the Grêmio Arena, which supposedly belonged to Biron. That's when the full extent of who he really was began to show. The investigation revealed the drug trafficking scheme, money laundering, in short, all that drug activity people used as fronts, fake businesses basically, the whole scheme behind his name. So, Biron was transferred to a federal prison outside of Rio Grande do Sul for security reasons. The 2020 trial. In February 2020, almost 5 years after the crime, Juliano Biron was finally tried by the jury court in Canoas. The session lasted more than 12 hours. In court, Biron faced the jurors, denied all charges, claimed innocence, and said the crime had ruined his life. The version he presented was that he and Paula were no longer together at the time and their 6-year relationship had ended. And that, on the night of the crime, he was at Paula's apartment when she arrived scared, crying, and confessed that she had killed Gustavo. According to Biron, Paula had committed the murder as proof of her love for him. They were not together, according to this version, but he was at her apartment and she then killed to prove her love. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that Biron in fact did not accept that his partner had any friendship or involvement with other men, that the crime was motivated by jealousy, and that he planned and executed the photographer with Paula's help. The jury did not buy Biron's version, okay? He was convicted of aggravated homicide and concealment of a corpse and sentenced to 20 years and 8 months in prison to be served in closed custody. Paula was supposed to be tried in the same session, but since she was free pending trial, she didn't show up at the courthouse. Her defense claimed health problems. The case had to be split, and her trial was left for later, the trial that changed everything. And that later only came in December 2023, more than 8 years after the crime. Paula had been arrested in October 2023 in Porto Alegre after the court ordered her pre-trial detention to ensure she would appear at the trial. And on December 15th, Paula sat in the defendant's seat at the Canoas courthouse and spoke for the first time. Her testimony lasted about 2 hours, and what she said changed a lot of people's perception of the case. Paula started by saying that she met Biron when she was 13 years old, that he introduced himself as a businessman, and that she had no idea who he really was. That over the years, during the 7 years they lived together, she found out that he was a drug dealer, that he led a gang, that he was a man capable of anything. But by that point, she was already trapped in a cycle of violence she couldn't escape. She said she tried to end the relationship several times, that she was beaten every time they went out to a party, that Biron threatened her family, and that he controlled every aspect of her life. And about the day of the crime itself, Paula's version was the one I already described, that she called Gustavo to say goodbye because she was planning to go to São Paulo. And that Biron showed up unexpectedly, saw the messages on her phone, and forced her, under threat of killing her entire family, to call the photographer and lure him to a meeting. Paula's defense argued that she was coerced by a criminal gang leader, that she was a victim of domestic violence. In a context where the aggressor had the power to carry out any threat, that she never planned anything, that she was forced to take part out of terror. Here, it seems to me there's a disconnected link in this chain. The fact that in the face of so much terror, so many threats, you're mine and no one else's, you're not leaving here, this is my property, and so on. How was she going to move to São Paulo? It's just a question that came to my mind. Anyway, the prosecution led by prosecutor Denise Girardi de Castro presented the investigation and forensic data, okay? She requested conviction for aggravated homicide with 3 qualifying factors, argued that Paula helped in carrying out the crime, and that the evidence, the messages, the dynamics of the meeting, and so on, the route, showed active participation, not coercion. After more than 12 hours of trial, the jury decided and acquitted Paula of the homicide charge, and the crime of concealing a corpse had already been considered time-barred. Gustavo's family left the courthouse without the conviction they had expected. The public prosecutor's office left convinced that the decision was a mistake, and the story didn't end there. The appeal. The public prosecutor's office of Rio Grande do Sul did not accept the acquittal. They appealed to the appellate court, arguing that the jury's decision was clearly contrary to the evidence in the case files. For those who don't know, guys, when the public prosecutor's office appeals an acquittal by the jury, they're not asking a higher court, for example, to convict the defendant. They're asking for the jury's decision to be annulled and for the defendant to be subjected to a new trial with new jurors. In April 2025, the Rio Grande do Sul Court of Appeals agreed with the public prosecutor's office, annulled the first trial, and ordered a new trial. According to the decision, the acquittal in December 2023 went against the evidence presented in the case. Paula would have to face the court again. And the new trial has now been scheduled for March 2026. And on February 26th, the court issued a pretrial detention warrant against Paula to ensure her presence at the trial. But from that day on, Paula disappeared. She couldn't be found anymore. And when the day of the trial came, the defendant's chair was empty. And she wasn't the only one who didn't show up, okay? The lawyer who was defending Paula informed that he wouldn't attend the session and resigned from the case. He requested a postponement, claiming health problems. Judge Bruno Barcelos de Almeida denied the request. The trial happened anyway, okay? As the law states, when the defendant, once properly summoned, does not appear. The legal defense was handled by lawyers appointed by the judge, and the prosecution was handled by prosecutors Daniela Fistarol and also Rafaela Yas Moreira Huergo. The only witness heard was Detective Marco Gans, who detailed the entire investigation to the jurors. The session started around 10 in the morning and ended at 7 in the evening. And this time, the jury reached the opposite conclusion from the first trial. Paula Caroline has now been convicted of murder with 3 aggravating factors: vile motive, cruel means, and a method that hindered the victim's defense. She received 26 years and 8 months in prison to be served in closed custody. The public prosecutor's office classified Paula not only as an accomplice, but also as the mastermind of the crime alongside Biron. But it's important to say that this conviction is not final, okay? The defense has filed an appeal to try to annul the second trial, claiming that the sentence was unfair. And up until the completion of this script here, the appeal still hadn't been decided, okay? Paula remains a fugitive with an outstanding arrest warrant, but there's one more detail, you see? And this detail is about Giuliano. After being convicted back in 2020, he should be serving his sentence. But at some point, he managed to move to semi-open custody and started serving his sentence with an electronic ankle monitor. It turns out that the Second Criminal Enforcement Court in Porto Alegre issued a warrant ordering him back to closed custody, maybe because of some violation or something like that. And Biron simply didn't show up. He disappeared. In June 2022, the intelligence division of the police down south received information that he was in a luxury condominium in Capão da Canoa on the northern coast of Rio Grande do Sul. When the police got there to check, they found Biron just chilling with his family. There was an armored car and a lot of cash in hand. Living as if he didn't have a conviction, right? He was arrested again and sent to the high-security penitentiary in Charqueadas. But not even the maximum security prison could hold him. In 2024, Biron disappeared again. This time, he vanished from Brazil for good. The police lost his trail. Interpol put his name on a red notice on a list of the world's most wanted criminals, tracked in 196 countries. Biron only showed up again in September 2025 in Santa Cruz de la Sierra, Bolivia. He had been living there for 11 months using fake documents, claiming to be from San Jose, Santa Catarina. He was identified by agents of Bolivia's special force to fight drug trafficking when he tried to renew the fake documents. It was enough to check the system for an Interpol red notice to appear. Biron had 4 outstanding arrest warrants and assets seized in Brazil, valued at 120 million reais. He was then handed over to the federal police at the Corumbá border in Mato Grosso do Sul and sent to a penitentiary in Rio Grande do Sul to actually start serving his sentence. And Gustavo Gargione was 22 years old with his whole life ahead of him. He fell in love with a woman who was supposedly trapped in a relationship with one of the most powerful drug dealers in the state. Maybe he knew it was dangerous. Maybe he thought he could get around it. What he probably didn't know is that when he got into that car to see the woman he really liked, that dangerous man was lying in wait for him. Gustavo thought he was getting into a car for a date. In fact, he was entering a courtroom where the sentence had already been decided before he even sat in the passenger seat. About that sentence, Paula says she was forced. One jury believed her and another didn't. All that's left now is to wait for the final outcome of this movie-worthy story, right? And that outcome still hasn't come. But I want to know your opinion. Based on everything I've told you, I tried to summarize in the best way possible here. Everything that was publicly reported. Based on all this, tell me in the comments what you think about this story, which above all is extremely tragic and sad, isn't it? Thanks for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.